Hello, dear friend, and welcome to this evening's tale, a journey into the mysterious heart of Victorian London, where gaslight flickers against ancient stones and secrets whisper through the fog-laden streets. Tonight, we share a story designed to quiet your thoughts, to slow the racing concerns of the day, and to guide you gently toward peaceful, restorative sleep. I'm so glad you've chosen to spend these twilight hours here, in this space we've created together, where mystery meets comfort, where the unknown becomes soothing rather than frightening. Before we begin our journey, I wonder, where are you listening from tonight? Perhaps you're nestled beneath soft blankets in a room far from Baker Street, or maybe you're watching the rain trace patterns down your own window pane. Wherever you are, know that you're welcome here, in this story, in this moment of quiet reflection. Now, settle in, get comfortable, and breathe with me as we begin. The rain whispered its ancient song against the windows of 221B Baker Street on that particular November evening, each droplet contributing its voice to a symphony that had played across London's rooftops for countless centuries. The sound created a gentle rhythm, a soft percussion that seemed to exist outside of time itself, as though the very same rain had fallen upon Tudor chimneys and Roman stones, connecting all those who had ever listened to its patient, persistent melody. Within those famous rooms, the fire had settled into its evening contentment, no longer crackling with youthful enthusiasm, but glowing with the steady, mature warmth of well-seasoned oak, reduced to ember and ash. The flames had diminished to a gentle dance, casting shadows that moved with hypnotic slowness across the walls, transforming the familiar geography of the sitting room into something softer, more dreamlike, more suited to contemplation than action. Sherlock Holmes occupied his customary chair, the leather worn smooth by years of restless thought and patient waiting. His long fingers were steepled beneath his chin, his grey eyes half closed, in that state between waking thought and the drift towards something deeper, something more intuitive. The gaslight from the street below created a golden nimbus around his profile, catching the smoke from his pipe as it curled upward in lazy spirals, each revolution slower than the last, eventually dissolving into the general warmth of the room. I sat across from him, my notebook open upon my knee, though I had written nothing for the past quarter hour. The page remained blank, waiting, patient as the rain, while I simply existed in that comfortable silence that had become the foundation of our friendship. Outside, the city murmured its evening prayers, the distant call of a hansom cab, the muffled conversation of passers-by hurrying home through the weather, the gentle hiss of rain meeting pavement. The clock upon the mantelpiece ticked its measured heartbeat, each second marked with the same gentle insistence, neither hurrying nor delaying, simply maintaining its ancient contract with time itself. The sound had become so familiar that one barely heard it, yet, in that quiet evening, each tick seemed to carry weight, to mark not just seconds, but small eternities, each moment complete and sufficient unto itself. Holmes stirred slightly, reaching for the teapot that sat upon the small table between us. Mrs. Hudson had brought it up an hour earlier, wrapped in a quilted cosy that she had stitched herself, decorated with small blue flowers that seemed almost luminous in the firelight. The sound of tea pouring into porcelain created a gentle music, liquid meeting vessel, warmth seeking new form. Steam rose in a delicate column, carrying with it the scent of bergamot and black leaves harvested in distant mountains, brought across oceans to comfort us on this rainy London evening. "Watson," Holmes murmured, his voice barely rising above the rain's whisper. "Do you recall Professor Aldrich Thornwood?" The name stirred memories, vague impressions of a tall, elderly gentleman with white hair that seemed perpetually dishevelled, as though he had just returned from walking through windstorms or puzzling over particularly troublesome equations. I had met him once, perhaps twice, at some university function where Holmes had been consulting on a matter of chemical analysis. "The astronomer," I replied, my own voice soft, unwilling to disturb the room's gentle equilibrium. Holmes nodded slowly, a movement that seemed to take considerable time, as though he were moving through water rather than air. The very same, a brilliant mind, though consumed with obsessions that many of his colleagues found eccentric. He paused, drawing upon his pipe, the tobacco glowing briefly like a small, controlled star. The smoke emerged slowly, thoughtfully, as though each particle carried a fragment of his contemplation into the visible world. "He came to see me 3 months ago," Holmes continued, his words measured, his tone reflective. "It was an afternoon much like this evening, though the rain then had not yet begun. He arrived in considerable agitation, or what passes for agitation in a man of such naturally contemplative disposition. His movements were hurried, his eyes bright with something between fear and fascination. I settled deeper into my chair, feeling its familiar embrace, the way it had conformed over time to my particular shape and habits. The fire crackled softly, a log shifting as it surrendered more completely to the flame's gentle consumption. "Thornwood spoke of a map," Holmes said, his voice taking on the quality of a storyteller, a guide into realms both factual and mysterious. Not an ordinary cartographic document, but something far more curious. An astronomer's map, he called it, though it charted not the heavens we observe with telescopes, but rather something he termed the celestial pathways of ancient knowledge. The phrase hung in the air, mysterious and evocative, like the smoke from Holmes's pipe. I found myself leaning forward slightly, drawn into the tale's gentle current. The map had been in his family for generations, Holmes explained, reaching again for his teacup, the delicate clink of porcelain against saucer, marking a small punctuation in the narrative. Passed down from father to son since the 17th century, when Thornwood's ancestor, also an astronomer, also named Aldrich, had created it during the period of the Restoration. This original Aldrich had been a member of the early Royal Society, a contemporary of Newton and Halley, though his name has faded from the official histories, remembered only in family chronicles and certain obscure footnotes in specialized texts. The rain intensified slightly, its rhythm growing fuller, more complex, like an orchestra adding new instruments to an ongoing composition. The sound created a cocoon around us, insulating the room from the outer world, making the space feel smaller, more intimate, perfectly suited to the sharing of secrets and mysteries. The elder Thornwood, the contemporary professor, had devoted much of his life to understanding this map, Holmes continued, his words flowing like honey, thick and sweet and slow. It depicted the night sky, certainly, with constellations marked in silver ink that had barely faded across the centuries. But overlaid upon these celestial markings were other symbols, other notations, written in a cipher that had resisted every attempt at interpretation. Numbers that followed no mathematical pattern he could discern. Latin phrases that seemed grammatically correct but semantically impossible. And strangest of all, locations marked upon the parchment that seemed to indicate places on Earth rather than points in the heavens. I took a sip of my own tea, now cooled to that perfect temperature where one could drink without hurry, could simply allow the liquid to warm from within, spreading comfort through chest and limbs. The bergamot scent mingled with the tobacco smoke, creating a fragrance that seemed to embody the very essence of contemplative evenings, of mystery pursued not with urgency, but with patient, methodical interest. For months, Thornwood had made no progress, Holmes said. The map remained beautifully enigmatic, a puzzle that resisted solution while simultaneously inviting continued study. Then, approximately 4 months ago, he made a discovery, a reference in a private letter collection at the British Museum, written by John Aubrey to an unnamed correspondent in 1671. In this letter, Aubrey mentioned the celestial document of A.T., which promises to reveal the 17 sanctuaries of the ancient watchers, those who measured the stars before Rome dreamed of empire. The fire settled again, sending up a small shower of sparks that danced briefly before winking out of existence, like fireflies performing their brief, luminous ballet. The shadows on the walls shifted correspondingly, creating the impression that the room itself was breathing, expanding and contracting in rhythm with some vast, cosmic respiration. Thornwood became convinced, Holmes continued, that his ancestor's map was the document Aubrey had referenced. More than that, he believed he had finally discovered the key to decoding at least part of the cipher. The 17 sanctuaries mentioned in the letter corresponded, he thought, to 17 locations marked upon the map, places in England, Scotland, and Wales where ancient peoples had built observatories, or what we might call observatories, though the word itself is far too modern for the sites in question. Stone circles, standing stones, earthwork formations aligned with celestial events. I could picture Thornwood in my mind's eye, bent over the ancient parchment in some cluttered study, gaslight illuminating the silver constellations, his elderly fingers tracing the mysterious symbols, while outside his window, London's modern world rushed past, oblivious to these ancient secrets. He had begun to visit these sites, Holmes said, travelling to each location marked upon the map, measuring angles, recording astronomical alignments, searching for, well, he was not entirely certain what he sought. Some confirmation of the map's accuracy, certainly. Perhaps some additional clues hidden in the landscape itself, waiting to be read by someone with the proper knowledge and perspective. Holmes paused to refill his pipe, the process unfolding with ritualistic precision. The opening of the tobacco pouch, the careful packing of the bowl, the strike of the match with its brief sulphurous bloom, the initial puffs drawing the flame downward, establishing the ember's steady glow. Each action seemed to occur in its own small eternity, complete and perfect and unhurried. Then, 3 months ago, Thornwood arrived at my door, Holmes said, resuming his narrative with the same gentle, measured cadence. He had just returned from the 12th site, a formation of standing stones in the Welsh mountains, a remote location requiring a full day's journey from the nearest railway station. There, while making his astronomical measurements at midnight, he had observed something extraordinary. The clock chimed the half-hour, its tone pure and clear, hanging in the air long after the mechanism had fallen silent. The vibration continuing in realms beyond ordinary hearing, felt rather than heard, a gentle stirring in the chest and bones. He saw lights, Holmes said softly, his voice dropping to barely above a whisper, inviting me to lean closer, to enter more fully into the mystery. Lights moving among the stones, though he was certain he had been alone. Lights that seemed to correspond with the positions of certain stars overhead, moving in deliberate patterns that suggested intelligence, purpose, design. He watched for nearly an hour, documenting everything in his field notebook, fighting against the interpretations his mind wished to impose. Supernatural phenomena, ghostly manifestations, visits from realms beyond mortal understanding. Outside, a carriage passed, its wheels creating a wet, rushing sound against the rain-slicked street. The horse's hooves a muffled rhythm, the entire equipage moving from hearing into silence, from presence to absence, leaving only the memory of its passage and the eternal rain. Being a man of science, Holmes continued, Thornwood sought rational explanation, reflected moonlight upon quartz formations within the stones, phosphorescence from some natural chemical process, even the possibility that he had fallen asleep without realizing it, had dreamed the entire sequence. But he could not shake the conviction that he had witnessed something genuinely anomalous, something that connected to the mystery of his ancestors' map. The fire required attention, and Holmes set aside his pipe to take up the iron poker, gently shifting the logs, encouraging new configurations that allowed fresh access to air, new surfaces for the flames to explore. The sound of iron against wood, against coal, created a gentle scraping music, and the disturbance sent new smoke curling up the chimney, drew fresh warmth into the room's comfortable atmosphere. He came to me, seeking not a detective, but a rational mind, Holmes said, settling back into his chair once the fire had been properly arranged. Someone who could listen to his account without dismissing him as senile or overly imaginative. Someone who might help him determine whether his experience had been hallucinatory or genuinely external, whether the map truly held secrets worth pursuing, or whether he had simply fallen into an old man's obsession, seeing patterns and meanings where none existed. I found myself wondering what counsel Holmes had offered, what wisdom he had dispensed to this troubled scholar. The rain provided its answer in a language older than words, simply continuing its patient fall, neither confirming nor denying, simply being, simply existing in its eternal present tense. I listened to his account, Holmes said, and suggested several investigations he might undertake. Chemical analysis of the stones where he had seen the lights, to determine if phosphorescent minerals were present. Consultation with other astronomers to confirm the celestial alignments he believed he had discovered. Above all, I counselled patience and methodical documentation. If the phenomenon were genuine, it would occur again. If hallucinatory, time and careful observation would reveal its true nature. Holmes reached for his tea once more. Finding it had cooled considerably, though he drank regardless, seemed to savour even the tepid liquid, finding in it some essential quality that transcended temperature. The firelight caught the cup's glaze, transforming ordinary pottery into something almost luminous, touched with amber and gold. Thornwood thanked me profusely, Holmes continued, and departed with what seemed to be renewed purpose, his agitation transformed into methodical resolve. I heard nothing from him for several weeks, then received a brief note indicating he had visited 3 more sites and had collected samples for chemical analysis. His tone was optimistic, energetic despite his years. He mentioned that he believed he was close to a significant breakthrough, that the map was revealing its secrets in unexpected ways. A small sound came from the hallway. Mrs. Hudson's tread upon the stairs, her characteristic rhythm ascending toward our floor. She entered after a soft knock, bringing with her the scent of kitchen warmth, of bread and soup and domestic comfort. She carried a tray bearing fresh tea and small cakes, which she set upon the table with practiced efficiency. "Thought you gentlemen might want something warm," she said softly, her voice carrying the gentle authority of one who has learned to care for others without fuss or ceremony. "The rain's settled in proper now. Won't be clearing before morning." "Your kindness is constant as the stars, Mrs. Hudson," Holmes replied with a slight smile, a rare softening of his usually austere features. She nodded, pleased, and withdrew as quietly as she had come, closing the door with a soft click that seemed to seal us once more into our private world of rain and firelight and unfolding mystery. Holmes poured fresh tea for both of us, the new pot releasing steam that carried the same bergamot scent, but somehow seemed renewed, revitalized, as though each pot of tea contained its own unique expression of the universal tea nature, similar but never identical, like snowflakes or souls. "That was 6 weeks ago," Holmes said, resuming the thread of his narrative. "I received no further communications from Thornwood. This was not immediately concerning. His research was extensive, his travels frequent, and I assumed he was simply absorbed in his work. Then, 3 days ago, I received a visitor." He paused, allowing the moment to expand, to create space for anticipation, without anxiety, curiosity without tension. The rain continued its patient work, washing the city, cleansing the stones, feeding the Thames, participating in cycles so vast that human lives occurred within them like single heartbeats within a lifetime. The visitor was Thornwood's niece, Miss Catherine Thornwood, Holmes explained, a woman of perhaps 30 years, possessed of her uncle's keen intelligence, though trained in mathematics rather than astronomy. She came to inform me that Professor Thornwood had vanished. The word hung in the air, vanished, carrying with it implications both mysterious and melancholy. The fire crackled softly, as if commenting upon this development, offering its flickering perspective on human disappearances and the mysteries that attend them. He had departed for his 17th site 12 days earlier, Holmes continued, his voice maintaining its soothing cadence despite the gravity of the information. This final location was in the far north of Scotland, in the Highlands, a stone circle overlooking the sea. He had written to Miss Thornwood, expressing great excitement, stating that he believed this final site would confirm everything, would complete the pattern, would reveal what he called the true purpose of the celestial map. He had arranged for rooms at an inn in the nearest village, had hired a local guide to lead him to the remote location, had packed equipment for a week's observation and measurement. I sipped my tea, feeling its warmth spread through me, providing comfort against the tale's increasingly mysterious elements. The cakes Mrs. Hudson had brought released a subtle scent of vanilla and lemon, simple pleasures that grounded the narrative in sensory reality, prevented it from floating too far into abstraction. "He never arrived at the inn," Holmes said quietly. "Or rather, he arrived, checked in, spent one night in his room, then departed with his hired guide the following morning. That was 11 days ago. Neither Thornwood nor the guide have been seen since. The local authorities have searched the area around the stone circle, have found no bodies, no signs of violence, no indication of what became of the two men. It is as though they walked into the landscape and were absorbed by it, accepted into its ancient geography. The shadows seemed to deepen slightly, though the fire's intensity had not changed. Perhaps a cloud had crossed the moon outside, though the rain made such astronomical observations impossible. The darkness gathered in the corners of the room, not threatening but present, patient, waiting. Miss Thornwood brought me the map, Holmes said, and now his voice carried a new quality, something between reverence and uncertainty. Her uncle had left it in her safekeeping, along with his research notes and correspondence. She presented it to me as one might present a religious relic, something simultaneously precious and potentially dangerous, an object that commands respect regardless of whether one fully understands its significance. Holmes rose from his chair, a slow unfolding of his tall frame, and moved to his desk. From a locked drawer, he withdrew a leather portfolio, which he brought back to the fireside. The portfolio was old, the leather cracked and stained with the evidence of much handling. The metal clasps tarnished, but still functional. "I have spent the past 3 days examining this document," he said, settling back into his chair, the portfolio resting upon his knees, applying every method of analysis at my disposal. "And I must confess, Watson, that it has led me into territories of thought I rarely visit, realms where logic and rationality encounter phenomena that resist easy categorization." He opened the portfolio with careful reverence, revealing the map within. Even from my position across the fire, I could see that it was indeed extraordinary. Parchment, yellowed with age, but still supple, covered with intricate markings in silver ink that caught the firelight, and seemed almost to glow with their own luminescence. The constellations were rendered with exquisite precision, each star marked with astronomical notation, lines connecting them in the familiar patterns: Ursa Major, Orion, Cassiopeia, all the celestial friends that have guided travelers since humans first looked upward and sought meaning in the scattered light. But overlaid upon these astronomical features were other markings, just as Holmes had described, symbols that seemed to belong to no alphabet I recognized, numbers arranged in columns that followed no mathematical logic I could discern, and 17 small circles, each marked with a tiny cross, distributed across the parchment in what seemed at first to be random placement, but which, upon longer observation, began to suggest some underlying pattern, some hidden order waiting to be perceived. "The silver ink is itself remarkable," Holmes murmured, adjusting the parchment slightly to catch the light more fully. "Chemical analysis suggests it contains actual silver particles suspended in a medium of gum, Arabic, and something else. Some organic compound I have not been able to identify. The ink has properties I have not encountered before. It seems to respond to temperature variations, growing slightly brighter when warmed, as though it retains some quality of living responsiveness despite its great age." I rose slowly and moved to stand beside Holmes's chair, looking down at the map, allowing my eyes to travel across its mysterious surface. The symbols seemed to shift slightly as I gazed at them, though this was surely an optical illusion created by the flickering firelight and my own fatigue. Still, the impression persisted that the map was not entirely static, not completely fixed, but rather existed in some state of gentle flux, its meanings and patterns never quite settling into absolute stability. Professor Thornwood believed, Holmes said softly, his finger tracing a line between two of the marked circles, that these 17 locations, when properly understood, would reveal not just ancient astronomical knowledge, but something more profound. In his final letter to his niece, he wrote that the map was a guide to the borderlands, the thin places where the veil grows gauze thin, where what we call sky and what we call earth exchange their essential natures. The phrase was beautiful and strange, poetry masquerading as explanation, explanation transforming into mystery. Outside, the rain intensified again, drumming now upon the roof, upon the window glass, creating a white noise that paradoxically made the room feel quieter, more isolated, more removed from the ordinary world. Miss Thornwood has engaged my services, Holmes continued, carefully closing the portfolio, to travel to Scotland, to investigate her uncle's disappearance, and to determine what became of him at that final site. She is a woman of means and has placed considerable resources at my disposal. More than that, she is desperate for answers, for closure, for understanding. The professor was her only living relative, the man who raised her after her parents' death, who encouraged her mathematical gifts, who treated her always as an intellectual equal, despite the constraints society places upon such relationships. He paused, and in that silence I understood what was coming, what role I was being invited to assume. "I would be honored, Watson," Holmes said, turning to meet my gaze, "if you would accompany me on this journey. We would depart tomorrow, taking the morning train north. The investigation may require several days, perhaps a week. The accommodations will be rustic, the weather uncertain, the outcome impossible to predict. But I believe this case touches upon matters that transcend the merely criminal or routine. There is mystery here, genuine mystery, the kind that beckons to those parts of ourselves that still wonder, that still seek, that still believe the world contains secrets worthy of discovery. How could I refuse such an invitation? The practice could spare me for a week. My patients were few this season, their ailments minor and capable of being attended by colleagues. More than that, Holmes had touched something essential, that part of me that had first followed him into adventure years ago, that had never entirely retired despite domestic comforts and professional obligations. The same part that now quickened at the thought of northern landscapes, ancient stones, mysteries, written in silver ink and hidden in remote highlands. "Of course," I said simply, "I would not dream of letting you venture into such uncertainty alone." Holmes smiled, a genuine expression of warmth and gratitude. "I rather thought you might say that, old friend. I took the liberty of having Mrs. Hudson begin preparations for your packing. We should rest well tonight. Tomorrow we'll begin a journey into territories both geographical and intellectual, a pursuit of answers that may lead us to questions we have not yet learned to ask." We returned to our chairs, to our tea, to the comfortable silence that followed significant decisions. The fire had burned down again, requiring no intervention, simply settling into its deepest, most enduring phase, where the coals glowed with patient intensity, releasing heat with miserly generosity, making the most of their substance before their eventual transformation into ash and memory. Tomorrow would begin the journey toward answers, but tonight we simply sat, Holmes and I, in that room that had hosted so many mysteries, that had seen the beginning of so many investigations. The gaslight from the street created its familiar patterns on the ceiling. The clock continued its patient measurement of time's passage. Hudson's footsteps sounded occasionally from the floor below, attending to her evening routines, maintaining the domestic order that made our adventures possible. Holmes had closed his eyes, his pipe forgotten in his hand, his breathing slow and steady. Perhaps he slept, or perhaps he had simply retreated into that internal space where he processed information, arranged facts, prepared his mind for the challenges ahead. I let him rest, let myself rest, allowed the evening to settle around us like a familiar blanket, warm and worn and entirely trustworthy. The fire whispered its ancient language, the rain added its voice to the conversation, and the night deepened around Baker Street, around London, around all the sleeping world. Somewhere in the north, standing stones waited in darkness, keeping their patient vigil, maintaining whatever secrets they had maintained for millennia. Tomorrow, we would begin our journey toward them, toward understanding, toward whatever revelations awaited in those remote and mysterious places. But tonight, there was only this: warmth and friendship, tea and tobacco, rain and firelight, the gentle drift towards sleep and dreams. I closed my own eyes, felt myself beginning to float on that tide that carries us from waking thought into deeper waters, where logic dissolves into symbol, where mystery becomes not a puzzle to be solved, but a state to be inhabited, accepted, even cherished. The room breathed around me. The city murmured its lullabies. And somewhere, in the space between sleeping and waking, the map waited, its silver ink capturing firelight, its ancient symbols patient as stars, its secrets suspended in that eternal now, where all mysteries exist, neither revealed nor concealed, but simply being, simply present, simply there. Innertert. The morning arrived with that particular quality of light that follows substantial rain. Everything washed clean, colours somehow both muted and intensified, the air carrying a freshness that seemed to have travelled from distant oceans and forests to bring London this gift of renewal. I woke early, though I had no memory of climbing the stairs to my room, no recollection of the transition from fireside contemplation to bed. The mind does this sometimes, elides certain passages of time, creating smooth narrative where there was actually discontinuity, gap, the small mysteries of consciousness that we all experience but rarely examine. Mrs. Hudson had prepared breakfast with her usual efficiency: eggs and toast, strong tea, porridge with cream and brown sugar. Holmes was already at the table when I descended, looking as though he had not slept at all, though his eyes were bright with that particular alertness that comes to him when engaged in intellectual pursuit. Before him on the table, carefully weighted at the corners with salt cellars and a butter dish, lay the astronomer's map. "I have been making copies of certain elements," he explained, gesturing to several sheets of paper covered with his precise handwriting and careful sketches of the map's more significant symbols. "We cannot risk taking the original into the field, but neither can I work effectively without reference to its details. These transcriptions will serve our purposes, while the map itself returns to Miss Thornwood's safekeeping." The morning unfolded in a series of small, precise activities: packing of clothing and equipment, arrangements with Mrs. Hudson for the maintenance of the rooms in our absence, a brief visit from Miss Thornwood herself to collect the map and to provide additional details about her uncle's habits and intentions. She was, as Holmes had suggested, a woman of considerable intelligence, her manner both anxious and controlled, desperate for answers, but unwilling to let desperation cloud judgment or distort facts. My uncle was methodical in everything, she told us, seated in the chair I had occupied the previous evening, accepting tea, but leaving it untouched, too tense to observe the social niceties her upbringing demanded. He would not have wandered carelessly, would not have taken unnecessary risks. If he is met with misfortune, it was not through folly or oversight. Something happened, something unexpected, something that could not have been anticipated even by a man of his considerable experience. Her hands twisted in her lap, a small gesture that betrayed the anxiety her voice and expression worked to conceal. Holmes noticed, of course, but said nothing, simply nodded, acknowledging both her statement and her distress. "We will do everything possible to determine what occurred," he said gently. "I cannot promise a happy outcome, but I can promise a thorough investigation, a methodical pursuit of whatever truth awaits us in those northern highlands." She left soon after, the map secured in a leather case she carried with the same careful reverence Holmes had shown. The door closed behind her, and we were left with our preparations, our copies and notes, our tickets for the afternoon train. The journey north took us first through familiar landscapes, the suburbs of London giving way to the countryside of the Midlands, fields and hedgerows, church spires and manor houses, all the comfortable geography of southern England. The train's rhythm created its own music, wheels on rails, the gentle swaying of the carriage, the periodic whistle announcing our passage through sleeping stations and drowsy villages. Holmes spent much of the journey studying his transcriptions, occasionally making notes, his mind clearly working through possibilities, arranging facts, preparing hypotheses. I watched the landscape transform gradually, almost imperceptibly at first, then with increasing drama as we travelled northward through the afternoon and into evening. The fields became more rugged, the walls stone rather than hedge, the trees fewer and more windswept. By the time darkness fell, we had entered territory that felt fundamentally different from the soft south, harder, older, less accommodating to human presence, more insistent upon its own terms. We spent that night at an inn in York, a comfortable establishment where we took separate rooms and a late supper of roast beef and vegetables, local ale that tasted of malt and earth. The other guests were few, travelling merchants, a family visiting relations, a solitary clergyman absorbed in a leather-bound book. The conversation around us created a gentle murmur, human voices blending into a soothing background, words indistinct, but the tone universally weary, the exhaustion of travel transformed into the anticipation of rest. Our rooms were simple but clean, the beds firm, the linens smelling of lavender and wind. I slept deeply, dreamlessly, and woke to rain once more, though this northern rain felt different from London's familiar precipitation, colder, more insistent, driven by winds that had travelled across moors and mountains, carrying with them the essence of wild places. The second day's journey took us deeper into the transformation. We crossed into Scotland as morning turned toward afternoon, the landscape now unmistakably highland. Great sweeps of heather-covered moors, mountains rising in the distance, their peaks lost in low-hanging clouds, rivers running dark with peat water, crossed by ancient stone bridges that seemed to have grown from the landscape, rather than been constructed upon it. The train made frequent stops, each station smaller than the last, until finally we descended at a tiny platform that seemed to exist in the middle of nowhere, surrounded by empty land stretching to empty horizons. A single porter attended our luggage, an elderly man whose English carried the soft lilt of Gaelic underneath, who looked at us with frank curiosity, but asked no questions, simply loaded our cases onto a cart and indicated that the village lay 2 miles distant, accessible by a rough track that paralleled the railway. We hired a trap from the village, a collection of perhaps 20 buildings, clustered around a small harbour, where fishing boats rocked gently in the protected water. The sea beyond the harbour looked grey and restless, waves rolling in from unimaginable distances, bringing with them the salt scent and the cry of gulls, the eternal presence of deep water and all its mysteries. The inn where Professor Thornwood had stayed was called the Mariner's Rest, a low stone building that looked as though it had been constructed in defiance of the wind, its walls thick, its windows small, its roof weighted with slate that had weathered to the colour of the sea itself. The proprietor was a woman of middle years, Mrs. MacLeod, whose face bore the lines of one who had spent a lifetime squinting against coastal weather, whose hands were rough, but whose manner was gentle, welcoming. I remember the professor," she said, when Holmes made inquiries, her voice carrying the music of the Highlands, each word given slightly more time than English typically allows, stretched and shaped by the rhythms of another tongue underlying the surface language. A kindly gentleman, very interested in the old stones. He stayed but one night, took his breakfast early, and set off with Jamie McKinnon as guide. That was the last I saw of either of them. She showed us to our rooms, simple chambers under the eaves, with sloping ceilings and small windows that looked out toward the sea. The furnishings were minimal: bed, washstand, a single chair, hooks on the wall for hanging clothes. But the rooms were warm, heated by a peat fire that filled the space with its distinctive scent, earthy and ancient, the smell of compressed time, of vegetation that grew when the world was young, now released through combustion into this present moment. We took our evening meal in the common room downstairs, joining the handful of locals who gathered there, fishermen mostly, men whose faces were weathered like the stone walls, whose hands bore the scars of nets and hooks and ropes, who spoke little but observed much, who listened to our questions with the patient attention of those who understand that strangers always ask questions, that the world is full of people seeking answers, and that sometimes those answers exist, and sometimes they do not, and the difference is not always clear. "The old stones," one of the fishermen said when Holmes inquired about the site Thornwood had gone to investigate. "Aye, they're real enough. Been there longer than memory, longer than the oldest tales. My grandmother's grandmother spoke of them, and they were old beyond counting even then. They stand on the headland, overlooking the sea, arranged in a circle like dancers, frozen in mid-step, waiting for music only they can hear." The phrase was unexpectedly poetic, and I saw Holmes note it, file it away for later consideration. The fisherman took a long drink of his ale, wiped his mouth with the back of his hand, continued. "Strange place, those stones. The sheep won't graze near them, though the grass grows thick and sweet. Birds won't nest in the cracks, though they're sheltered from the wind. And sometimes, on certain nights, there's a feeling, hard to describe to those who haven't stood there. A feeling like the world is thinner somehow, like you might step through into somewhere else if you're not careful about where you place your feet. Another fisherman, younger, laughed, though not unkindly. Old Hamish sees mystery everywhere, he said, his tone affectionate. Next, he'll be telling you about the lights. Hamish, the older fisherman, did not laugh. His eyes, in the firelight, held something serious, something that had seen things he could not fully explain or dismiss. "Aye, the lights," he said quietly. "I've seen them myself, more than once. Not often, mind you, but sometimes, on nights when the moon is dark and the stars are bright, there are lights among the stones. Moving lights, like lanterns being carried in procession, though there's never anyone there when you investigate. Just the stones and the wind and the sea below." The room had grown quieter, I realized. The other men had stopped their separate conversations, were listening now, their faces showing that mixture of skepticism and uncertainty that attends all discussions of phenomena that resist easy explanation. Jamie McKinnon knew those stones better than anyone, Mrs. McLeod said from behind the bar, where she was drying glasses with a cloth, each movement slow and methodical. He'd lived here all his life, had taken many visitors to see them over the years. Scholars and tourists, people looking for the romance of ancient mysteries. If anyone could have kept the professor safe, it would have been Jamie. The implication hung in the air that something had occurred which even Jamie's knowledge and experience could not prevent or defend against. Holmes asked several more questions about Jamie's character, about the exact route to the stones, about the weather conditions on the day the two men had departed. The answers came slowly, thoughtfully, each person contributing what they knew, building a collective portrait of that morning 11 days ago. Clear weather, unusual for the season, the professor in good spirits, excited. Jamie carrying supplies, food, water, blankets, in case the weather changed. They had set off on foot, following the coastal path that led north along the cliffs, a journey of perhaps 3 hours at a steady pace. The stones stood at the end of a promontory, isolated, surrounded on 3 sides by sheer drops to the sea below. There was only one approach, only one path in and out. The constable organised a search, Mrs. McLeod said. 20 men, experienced hill walkers and climbers, who knew the area intimately. They searched for 3 days, covered every inch of the headland, examined the base of the cliffs in case the professor or Jamie had fallen. They found nothing, no bodies, no equipment, no sign of struggle or accident. It was as though the earth had simply opened and swallowed them, then closed again, leaving no trace. The rain had intensified outside, driven now by wind that moaned around the building's corners, finding every gap and crack, making its presence known through sound and chill. The fire in the hearth seemed to burn more fiercely in response, as though in defiance of the darkness and cold, asserting the human claim to warmth and light against the vast indifference of the natural world. We retired to our rooms shortly after, both Holmes and I weary from travel, needing rest before tomorrow's expedition to the stones. My room's small window rattled in its frame, the wind testing its security, and through the glass I could see nothing but darkness, complete and absolute, the kind of darkness that exists far from cities, where human light makes no impression on the vast night surrounding it. I lay in the narrow bed, listening to the wind, to the rain, to the distant sound of waves against rocks, the eternal percussion of sea meeting land, wearing away stone molecule by molecule, grain by grain, with patience that made human lifespans seem like heartbeats, civilizations like footprints in sand. Sleep came slowly, and when it came, it brought dreams of standing stones and silver maps, of lights moving in patterns that almost made sense, that seemed on the verge of revealing some fundamental truth about the nature of reality, only to dissolve into confusion and static, leaving only the impression of significance without its substance. I woke several times in the night, disoriented, unsure for a moment where I was, the room unfamiliar, the sounds outside strange and wild. Each time, I eventually reoriented myself, remembered the journey, the purpose, the mystery we had come to investigate. And each time, before sleep claimed me again, I thought of Professor Thornwood and his guide, wondered where they were, whether they still existed in any meaningful sense, whether the questions we sought to answer had answers that human minds could comprehend or accept. Morning came reluctantly, the darkness yielding slowly to grey light that revealed a landscape of stone and sea and sky, all rendered in shades of silver and slate, beautiful in its austerity, in its refusal to accommodate human preferences for comfort or ease. The wind had diminished but not ceased, still blowing steadily from the ocean, carrying with it the taste of salt and the cries of seabirds wheeling overhead, their voices sharp and lonely, perfectly suited to this remote and ancient place. Mrs. MacLeod provided breakfast, porridge and fresh bread, strong tea and honey harvested from local bees who somehow found sufficient flowers in this harsh landscape to produce their golden treasure. We ate in silence, Holmes absorbed in thought. I simply present, allowing the warmth of the food to prepare me for the day ahead. "You'll be wanting a guide," Mrs. MacLeod said, as we prepared to depart. "Young Donald McKinnon, Jamie's nephew, has offered to take you. He knows the way as well as his uncle did, and he's eager to help discover what became of Jamie. They were close, those two. The disappearance has been hard on the boy." Donald proved to be in his early 20s, tall and lean, with the same weathered face common to everyone in this coastal village. A face that had learned early to squint against wind and glare, to endure discomfort without complaint. He greeted us with quiet courtesy, shouldered a pack containing supplies, and led us out of the village along the coastal path Mrs. MacLeod had described. The walk was indeed approximately 3 hours, though the time seemed both longer and shorter. Longer because of the steady exertion required, the constant attention to footing on the rough path, the wind that pushed against us, making every step an effort. Shorter because the landscape itself seemed to compress time, or perhaps to render it irrelevant, to insist that one could walk here for hours or days or years, and the experience would remain essentially unchanged, eternal in its particulars. The path followed the cliff edge, sometimes close enough that we could look directly down to the sea below, where waves crashed against dark rocks, sending spray high into the air, the water churning white before subsiding back into the ocean's grey-green depths. Other times, the path moved inland, crossing rough grassland dotted with heather and gorse, the vegetation low and wind-sculpted, shaped by forces that had worked upon it for generations. Donald walked ahead, his pace steady, occasionally pointing out landmarks, a particular rock formation, the ruins of an ancient settlement, a place where seals sometimes basked in rare sunshine. He spoke little without prompting, but when Holmes asked questions, his answers were thoughtful, detailed, demonstrating both knowledge and intelligence. "Did your uncle mention anything unusual about his previous trips to the stones?" Holmes asked at one point, his voice raised slightly to carry over the wind. Donald considered this, his stride never faltering. "He said they always gave him an odd feeling," he replied, "like being watched, though there was never anyone there. He didn't believe in ghosts or spirits, Uncle Jamie, but he respected the stones, treated them with a kind of courtesy, like you might treat the home of someone powerful and unpredictable. He said the old ones who built the stones understood something we've forgotten, some relationship between earth and sky that we've lost in our modern rush. We crested a rise, and there, in the distance, I saw them, the standing stones, exactly as described, arranged in a circle on the headland's furthest point. Even from this distance, perhaps half a mile, they possessed a presence, a quality of deliberate placement that distinguished them from the natural rock formations scattered across the landscape. They stood like sentinels, like ancient guardians, keeping watch over the boundary between land and sea, between the known and the unknowable. As we approached, more details became apparent. There were 17 stones, corresponding exactly to the 17 marked sites on Thornwood's map. They varied in height from perhaps 5 feet to over 10, rough-hewn or perhaps never hewn at all, simply selected for their natural shapes and erected with tremendous labour, positioned according to principles we could only guess at. The circle they formed was not perfectly regular, but possessed a kind of organic symmetry, as though the builders had worked with mathematical precision, while simultaneously accommodating intuitions that transcended mere measurement. We entered the circle slowly, reverently, passing between 2 of the larger stones. The wind, which had been constant throughout our walk, seemed to diminish within the circle, not disappearing entirely, but losing some of its force, as though the stones provided shelter, created a pocket of relative calm within the larger weather. Holmes immediately began a methodical examination, walking the circle's perimeter, studying each stone, occasionally consulting the notes he had made from the map. I watched him work, this familiar ritual of observation and deduction, but found my attention drawn equally to the stones themselves, to their weathered surfaces, to the lichens that grew in patches of orange and grey, to the way they stood so solidly, so completely present, having stood thus for millennia, having witnessed the passage of countless generations, the rise and fall of languages and religions, and entire worldviews. Donald stood at the circle's centre, turning slowly, his gaze moving across the assembled stones. "Uncle Jamie and I came here once, years ago," he said quietly. "I was just a boy, maybe 10 years old. He brought me to see the sunset from within the circle. I remember the light turning everything gold, the stones casting long shadows, and Uncle Jamie telling me that some places are special, are set apart, not by what happens there, but by what they remember, what they hold in their stones and soil. He said, the earth has memory, deeper than human memory, and places like this are where that memory surfaces, where the past and present exist together." It was another unexpectedly poetic observation, and I wondered if the landscape itself inspired such thoughts, if spending one's life in the presence of such ancient mysteries naturally cultivated a more philosophical perspective on existence and meaning. Holmes had completed his circuit of the stones, and now stood examining the ground within the circle, occasionally kneeling to study something more closely. The grass here was short, cropped by wind and the thin soil, with occasional patches of bare earth showing through. He produced a small magnifying glass from his pocket, applying it to various spots, his attention completely absorbed in whatever minute details he was discovering. "There are signs of disturbance," he announced after several minutes of this close examination. "Here and here, the grass has been pressed down, not by feet, but by something larger, heavier, as though objects were placed on the ground and left for some time. And here, near the centre, ash, very old, from a fire that burned with intense heat, hot enough to vitrify the soil slightly, to transform it partially into glass." He collected samples of the ash, carefully placing them in small envelopes he produced from his pockets, labeling each with location and observations. I had seen him perform this same ritual hundreds of times, in London alleys and country estates, always the same methodical attention to physical evidence, the conviction that the material world held answers for those patient and skilled enough to read them. "The police search found no evidence," Donald said, a note of confusion in his voice. "They examined everything, took measurements, photographed the site. How is it you're finding what they missed?" Holmes smiled slightly, though his attention remained on his work. "I am not finding what they missed," he replied. "I suspect they saw everything I am seeing. The difference is that I know what I'm looking for. The police sought evidence of accident or violence, of struggle or misadventure. I am seeking evidence of something else entirely, of ritual, perhaps, or of deliberate action following a predetermined plan." He stood, brushing dirt from his knees, and turned to face the sea. From here, the view was extraordinary. The headland dropped away sharply, just beyond the last stones, creating a precipice that fell perhaps 200 feet to the churning water below. The horizon stretched unbroken, a line between sea and sky that seemed absolute, definitive, the edge of the world as experienced by anyone standing in this spot. "Professor Thornwood came here seeking confirmation," Holmes said, speaking more to himself than to us, working through his thoughts aloud. He believed the 17 sites marked on his ancestors' map corresponded to places where ancient peoples had observed something significant, had measured something, had built these monuments as markers or instruments, or perhaps both simultaneously. At each previous site, he had gathered data, had taken astronomical measurements, had confirmed alignments between the stones and certain celestial phenomena. This was to be the final confirmation, the completion of the pattern. The wind gusted, stronger for a moment, carrying with it a spray of sea mist that dampened our faces, left our skin tasting of salt. A bird cried overhead, a raven or crow, black against the grey sky, circling once before flying inland, its wings cutting the air with purposeful strokes. What did he expect to find? I asked. What was the pattern meant to reveal? Holmes turned to look at me, and his expression was strange, uncertain in a way I rarely saw, as though he stood at the edge of understanding something that challenged his fundamental assumptions about the nature of reality. "I believe," he said slowly, "that Thornwood expected these sites to reveal some ancient astronomical knowledge, some understanding of celestial mechanics that predated historical civilization. The alignment of the stones with certain stars, with solstice and equinox positions, with planetary movements, all of this has been documented at similar sites throughout Britain and Europe. But Thornwood suspected something more, something encoded in the specific arrangement of these 17 locations, in the pattern they formed when viewed as a whole rather than as individual sites. He paused, withdrew from his pocket the transcriptions he had made of the map's mysterious symbols, studied them while the wind pulled at the pages, tried to tear them from his grasp. The numbers on the map, he continued, which appeared random to modern mathematical analysis, are coordinates, not longitude and latitude as we understand them, but an older system, perhaps, or a system based on different reference points. The symbols that seemed to belong to no known alphabet are astronomical notation, markers indicating specific stellar positions, but rendered in a notation that predates Greek or Babylonian astronomy, that suggests knowledge from a source we have not previously recognized or credited. Donald had been listening with intense focus, his young face serious, processing these ideas that must have seemed both alien and somehow familiar, like hearing a story one knows but has never quite been told. "And the 17 sites?" he asked. "What do they mark when taken together?" Holmes carefully folded his papers, returned them to his inner pocket. "That," he said, "is what I believe Professor Thornwood discovered. That is the knowledge that brought him here for this final confirmation. And that is the knowledge that may have led to his disappearance." The statement hung in the air, neither question nor assertion, but something between, an opening into further mystery rather than a closing toward solution. I found myself shivering slightly, though not entirely from cold, feeling the weight of the place, the accumulated centuries represented by these stones, the sense of standing at the intersection of different orders of time and meaning. "The lights that people have reported seeing here," Holmes said, addressing Donald directly. "Have you ever witnessed them yourself?" The young man nodded slowly. "Once," he replied. 2 years ago, I was returning late from checking fishing nets in a northern cove. It was well past midnight, the sky clear and bright with stars. As I passed near the headland, I saw lights moving among the stones, blue-white, very pure, like starlight given form. They moved in a pattern, a dance, circling the stones in a specific sequence. I watched for perhaps 5 minutes. Then they faded, simply diminished until there was only darkness and stone again. "Did you feel afraid?" Holmes asked. Donald considered this carefully. "No," he said finally. "Not afraid, but I felt observed, as though I had witnessed something not meant for ordinary eyes, as though I had glimpsed some ceremony or process that existed in a realm parallel to our own, visible only occasionally, only under certain conditions." I told Uncle Jamie about it, and he nodded, said he'd seen similar lights, said they were part of what made the stones special, what marked them as different from ordinary rock formations. Holmes walked to the edge of the circle, stood looking out to sea, his tall figure dark against the grey expanse of water and sky. I joined him, felt the full force of the wind here, at the boundary, where the circle's shelter diminished, and the open air reasserted its dominance. "Something happened here," Holmes said quietly, his voice barely audible over the wind. 11 days ago, Professor Thornwood and Jamie McKinnon stood where we are standing. They had the same view, the same wind, the same ancient stones surrounding them. Thornwood had brought equipment. I know this from Miss Thornwood's account. Instruments for astronomical measurement, notebooks for recording observations, perhaps other tools we're not aware of. He was excited, convinced he stood on the threshold of significant discovery. He paused, and in that pause I heard the sea below, the wave's eternal conversation with the rocks, a dialogue that had continued for epochs, that would continue long after our brief presence here had been forgotten. And then, Holmes continued, something occurred that removed both men from this place without trace, without sign of struggle or violence, without leaving evidence that conventional investigation could interpret. The police concluded that they must have fallen from the cliff, that their bodies were swept out to sea. But I do not believe this. The ground near the cliff edge shows no sign of disturbance, no loose stones or scuff marks indicating a slip or loss of footing. More than that, both men were experienced in these landscapes, knew the dangers, would not have approached the edge carelessly, especially not in the dark, if they were conducting astronomical observations that required attention to the sky rather than the ground. I tried to imagine it, the professor and his guide, standing among these stones at night, the stars bright overhead, the equipment set up and carefully adjusted. What had they seen? What had they measured? What revelation had come to them in this remote and ancient place? The ash you found, I said to Holmes, the evidence of intense heat. Could that indicate some kind of fire was lit as part of Thornwood's observations? Perhaps a signal fire or lighting for his equipment? Holmes shook his head slowly. The ash is far older than 11 days, he replied. Weeks old at least, possibly months. No, this fire was not Thornwood's. This was something else, something that occurred before his arrival, though possibly related to the same phenomena he came to investigate. We spent another hour at the stones, Holmes making additional observations, taking measurements of the distances between stones, the angles they created when viewed from various positions, the sight lines they established toward particular features of the landscape and seascape. Donald assisted with this work, holding one end of a measuring tape, reading a compass when requested, his natural intelligence quickly grasping what was needed, even when the purpose was not entirely clear. I wandered the circle myself, touching the stones, feeling their cold, rough surfaces, the texture of millennia weathering, the presence they embodied. Each stone felt different under my hand, this one slightly warm despite the cold day, that one seeming to vibrate faintly, as though resonating with some frequency beyond hearing. Another, covered in lichens that formed patterns almost like writing, almost like the mysterious symbols on Thornwood's map. Was I imagining these differences, projecting meaning onto blank stone? Or was there something genuinely anomalous about this place? Some quality that affected perception, that opened possibilities normally closed in more ordinary locations? I could not say with certainty, could only note my impressions and wonder at their source and significance. The afternoon was advancing, the light beginning that slow decline toward evening, when Holmes finally concluded his examination. He stood at the circle's center, turning slowly, taking in the complete panorama, the stones, the sea, the sky, the distant mountains to the south. We should return before dark, Donald said, practical concern evident in his voice. The path is treacherous in failing light, and the weather can change quickly here. Fog rolls in from the sea without warning, turning the familiar strange, making navigation difficult even for those who know the land well. Holmes nodded agreement, but his attention remained on the stones, his mind clearly working through some problem, some sequence of thoughts that had not yet reached resolution. Finally he spoke, his voice thoughtful, almost hesitant. "I would like to return tonight," he said, "to observe this place in darkness, under the same conditions Thornwood would have experienced. I cannot claim to know what he sought, but perhaps by replicating his circumstances, some understanding might emerge, some insight that daylight obscures. Donald's expression showed concern, but also understanding, the recognition that sometimes questions demand uncomfortable pursuits, that answers often hide in places and times that convenience would prefer to avoid. "I will guide you," he said simply. "We'll return to the village, take rest and food, then come back as night falls." My uncle would have done the same, would have helped however he could. The least I can do is honor his memory by assisting those who seek to understand his disappearance. We began the walk back, retracing our morning route in reverse, the light now slanting from a different angle, creating new shadows, new perspectives on the same landscape we had passed through hours earlier. Everything looked subtly different, as though the world showed different faces, depending on the direction from which it was approached, the time at which it was observed. The journey took slightly longer returning, all of us tired from the day's exertions, the constant wind, the mental effort of processing the strange atmosphere of the stones. We spoke little, each lost in private thoughts, private attempts to make sense of what we had witnessed and experienced. The village, when we finally reached it, seemed almost startling in its normalcy, its human scale and purpose. Smoke rose from chimneys, lights glowed in windows. The smell of cooking fish and peat fires created an atmosphere of domestic comfort that contrasted sharply with the wild isolation of the headland. It was like returning from one world to another, from the ancient and mysterious to the familiar and mundane, and I felt a small relief at this return, a gratitude for walls and warmth, for the human creation of shelter against the vast indifference beyond. Mrs. MacLeod had prepared a substantial meal, fish stew thick with vegetables, bread still warm from the oven, ale to wash away the day's salt and dust. We ate gratefully, feeling strength return with the food, feeling our bodies acknowledge the nourishment, the care implicit in the preparation and serving of a proper meal. "You're going back tonight, then?" Mrs. MacLeod said, a statement rather than a question, her knowing eyes reading our intentions. "Be careful. The headland is no place for carelessness, especially in the dark. Men have died there, more than a few over the years. The cliffs are treacherous, the wind can be disorienting, and there are places where a single misstep means a fall into nothing, into the sea and the rocks below. We will exercise extreme caution," Holmes assured her. "Donald will guide us, and we will bring adequate lighting. We seek only to observe, to understand something of what Professor Thornwood experienced. We will take no unnecessary risks." She nodded, though her expression remained troubled. The natural concern of one who has seen the sea and the stones claim too many lives, who understands that good intentions and careful planning do not always suffice against the dangers inherent in such places. We rested for several hours, allowing the meal to settle, giving our bodies time to recover from the day's exertions. I lay on my narrow bed, listening to the wind outside, to the distant murmur of the sea, and tried to sleep, but could not. My mind too active, too full of questions and images. The standing stones, the ash. Holmes had found, the lights Donald had described. Professor Thornwood's excited anticipation of discovery, his mysterious disappearance. What had he found? What had the final sight revealed? And why had that revelation led not to published papers and academic acclaim, but to vanishing, to silence, to absence? Full darkness had fallen when we gathered again in the inn's common room. Donald had prepared a pack with supplies: oil lamps, warm blankets, a flask of tea, basic first aid materials. He had changed into heavier clothing, boots suitable for rough terrain, a thick coat that would provide protection against the coastal wind. The walk back felt entirely different in darkness. The landscape transformed into something alien and uncertain. Our oil lamps created small pools of golden light that moved with us, illuminating a few feet in each direction, while leaving everything beyond wrapped in impenetrable black. The path we had followed so confidently in daylight became a series of guesses and careful probings, each step requiring attention, verification. The sea, invisible now except where starlight caught the foam of breaking waves, roared with what seemed like increased volume, as though darkness amplified its voice, gave it greater claim to dominance over this landscape. The wind carried salt spray that left our faces damp and cold, that made our clothes heavy with moisture. Above, when we occasionally looked up from our careful navigation, the stars shone with extraordinary brilliance. Here, far from any artificial light, the heavens revealed themselves with a completeness impossible in cities, or even most countryside. The Milky Way stretched across the sky like a great river of light. Individual stars, too numerous to count, patterns within patterns, the vast architecture of the cosmos displayed with overwhelming grandeur. The walk took nearly 4 hours in the darkness, our pace necessarily slow. The constant attention required exhausting in ways the morning journey had not been. But finally, we saw them ahead, the standing stones, visible as darker shapes against the star-bright sky, their presence palpable even before our lamps illuminated their surfaces. We entered the circle once more, and immediately I felt the difference. At night, this place possessed a different character, no longer merely ancient, but somehow active, alert, as though darkness awakened something that daylight kept dormant. The stones seemed larger, more present, their shadows cast by our lamps, moving and shifting as we walked, creating the impression of motion, of stones not quite as stationary as geology insisted. Holmes directed us to extinguish our lamps, to allow our eyes to adjust to the natural darkness, to see the place as Thornwood would have seen it. We complied, and for a moment the sudden darkness was complete, disorienting, almost frightening. Then, gradually, as my eyes adapted, the stars emerged, their light sufficient to reveal the general shapes of the stones, the outline of the circle, the open expanse of sky above. "This is what he would have experienced," Holmes said softly, his voice strange in the darkness, disembodied, coming from somewhere nearby, but impossible to locate precisely. Standing here, in this circle, under these stars, seeking to understand what his ancestor had encoded in that map, what knowledge these stones were meant to preserve or transmit. We stood in silence, each of us alone with our thoughts, yet together in this strange vigil. The wind moved through the stones, creating sounds that almost resembled voices, almost formed words, suggestions of meaning that dissolved upon closer attention. The sea below maintained its eternal percussion, waves striking rock, the sound carrying clearly in the night air. Minutes passed, or perhaps hours. Time seemed to function differently here, to lose its usual discrete character, flowing instead, like the wind or the water, measurable only in approximate terms, in general, rather than specific durations. Then, Donald, who had been standing apart from us, near the eastern edge of the circle, spoke suddenly, his voice carrying a note of excitement mixed with uncertainty. "There," he said. "Do you see? The lights, they're beginning." I turned to look where his voice directed, and at first saw nothing unusual, just stars and stones and darkness. But then, gradually, I perceived what he meant. A faint luminescence, blue-white, exactly as he had described, beginning to emerge from or around several of the stones, growing slowly brighter, not like fire, but like moonlight somehow concentrated, given form and motion. Holmes moved quickly to where the phenomenon was most pronounced, pulling from his pocket a small notebook and pencil, attempting to document what we were witnessing. I joined him, transfixed by the sight, by the impossible beauty and strangeness of these lights that should not exist, that violated every principle of rational explanation I could apply. The lights began to move, slowly at first, then with increasing purpose and speed, circling the stones in a specific pattern that seemed choreographed, deliberate, meaningful. They pulsed slightly, their intensity varying rhythmically, creating a visual music, a dance of illumination that held the eye and quieted the mind. I felt no fear, I realized with surprise. Despite the strangeness, despite the impossibility of what I was witnessing, I felt only wonder, only a deep sense of privilege at being present for something so extraordinary, so completely outside ordinary experience. The lights continued their movement for perhaps 10 minutes, though again the duration was difficult to gauge, subjective, elastic. Then, as gradually as they had emerged, they began to fade, their luminescence diminishing until only the stars remained, only the familiar darkness and stone, leaving us to wonder if we had truly seen what we believed we had seen, or whether some collective hallucination, some shared delusion, had briefly overtaken us. "Extraordinary," Holmes breathed, his voice filled with an emotion I rarely heard from him, something like awe, like the recognition of encountering mystery that exceeded his considerable powers of analysis and explanation. Absolutely extraordinary. Donald was trembling slightly, I noticed, his breathing rapid, his eyes wide. "Uncle Jamie saw this," he said quietly. "This is what the professor came to witness. This is the confirmation he sought." Holmes was examining one of the stones where the light had seemed most intense, running his hands over its surface, feeling for warmth, for any residual evidence of the phenomenon we had witnessed. He produced a small instrument from his pocket, a thermometer, and took readings at various points on the stone, noting each measurement carefully, despite the difficulty of writing in the near-complete darkness. "The stone is warmer," he announced, "several degrees above ambient temperature, concentrated in specific areas where the light appeared most intense. This is not hallucination, not collective delusion. Something physical occurred, something that involved energy transfer, heat generation, though the mechanism remains completely unclear." He continued his examination, moving from stone to stone, taking measurements, making observations, working with the same methodical intensity I had seen him apply to countless investigations. But there was something different in his manner tonight, a quality of engagement that went beyond mere professional interest, that suggested he was encountering something that challenged not just his knowledge, but his understanding of what knowledge might encompass, what reality might contain. The wind had changed direction, now blowing from the south, carrying warmer air, scents of earth and growing things, rather than just salt and sea. With it came a sound, faint but distinct, music or something like music, tones that seemed to emerge from the stones themselves, from the wind moving through and around them, creating harmonics, resonances, an acoustic phenomenon that natural acoustics could not adequately explain. We all heard it. I could tell from the way both Holmes and Donald had stopped moving, had turned to face the stones, listening with complete attention. The sounds were not random, but patterned, structured, almost like a melody, though unlike any music composed by human hands. It spoke of depths and distances, of timescales that made human history seem like a brief flicker, of spaces that extended beyond the visible horizon into realms where earth and sky exchanged their properties, where the boundaries we relied upon became permeable, negotiable, uncertain. Then, as suddenly as it had begun, the music ceased. The wind continued, but the strange harmonics had ended, leaving only ordinary acoustic phenomena, the familiar sounds of weather and geography, nothing inexplicable or mysterious. We stood in silence, processing what we had experienced, each attempting in our own way to integrate these impossible perceptions into some framework that could accommodate them without complete abandonment of rationality or empirical grounding. Professor Thornwood stood here, Holmes said finally, speaking slowly, working through his thoughts as he articulated them. He witnessed what we have just witnessed, the lights, the sounds, the physical manifestations of some phenomenon we cannot yet explain. He had his instruments, his measuring devices, his notes and calculations. He would have been recording everything, documenting these observations with the same scientific rigor he had applied to all his research. Holmes paused, turning to survey the entire circle, the complete assembly of stones under the vast canopy of stars. And then, he continued, something further occurred, something that went beyond mere observation, beyond passive witnessing, something that involved him directly, that led to his disappearance and that of his guide. Some interaction, some crossing of a boundary, some step from observer to participant. The implications of this hung in the air, unspoken but understood. We were standing in a place where the normal rules seemed suspended, where phenomena occurred that science could not explain, where the ancient builders had somehow encoded knowledge that modern civilization had forgotten or never possessed. And in such a place, disappearances might not mean death or accident, but something stranger, something that our categories of thought could not quite grasp or contain. A sound from beyond the circle startled us all. Footsteps, unmistakably human, approaching from the path we had taken. Our hands went to our lamps, preparing to relight them, to see who or what was approaching in this remote place at this unlikely hour. The footsteps grew closer, and then a figure emerged into the starlight, resolving into a man of perhaps 60 years, wearing rough working clothes, carrying a walking stick, his face weathered and kind, his eyes bright with intelligence. "Forgive the intrusion," the man said, his voice cultured, his accent suggesting education, despite his humble appearance. "I saw your lights from my cottage, knew someone was here at the stones. I thought I should investigate, ensure you are not in danger or difficulty." Holmes stepped forward, extending his hand in greeting. "Sherlock Holmes," he said. "This is my colleague, Dr. Watson, and our guide, Donald McKinnon. We are investigating the disappearance of Professor Aldrich Thornwood and his guide, who vanished from this location 11 days ago." The man's expression shifted, becoming somber, touched with what seemed like genuine sadness. "Ah, yes," he said quietly. "Poor Thornwood. I knew him, you know. Not well, but we had corresponded over the years. I am, or was, also an astronomer before my retirement. My name is Malcolm Granger. I live alone now, in a small cottage about a mile south of here. I came to these parts specifically because of the stones, because of the phenomena associated with them." He paused, seeming to weigh how much to reveal, how much these strangers might be willing to hear and accept. "I have studied these stones for 30 years, Granger continued. Measured them, photographed them, documented the lights and sounds, the strange effects they produce. I knew Thornwood was coming, knew he believed he had solved some aspect of the mystery his ancestor had encoded in that extraordinary map. I had hoped to speak with him, to share observations, to compare theories, but he never came to see me. He went directly to the stones, and, well, you know what followed." Holmes was listening with complete attention, his mind clearly racing, processing this new information, this unexpected witness who might hold crucial insights. "What do you believe happened to him?" Holmes asked directly. Granger was silent for a long moment, his gaze moving across the assembled stones, his expression both reverent and troubled. "I believe," he said slowly, "that the stones are not merely monuments or astronomical instruments. I believe they are doorways, or perhaps more accurately, they are places where the fabric of reality grows thin, where it becomes possible, under specific conditions, to move between states of being, between what we call our world and something else, something parallel, something that occupies the same space but exists in a different mode, a different frequency of vibration." The words should have sounded mad, should have triggered skepticism and dismissal. But here, in this place, after what we had witnessed, they carried a strange plausibility, a resonance with experience that made them difficult to reject entirely. "You're suggesting," Holmes said carefully, "that Thornwood somehow passed through, that he crossed into this other state or realm, and that this explains why no physical trace of him can be found in our ordinary world." Granger nodded slowly. "It is the only explanation I have found that accounts for the evidence, or rather for the lack of evidence. The stones are not new in their strangeness. There are accounts going back centuries, fragments of folklore and legend that speak of people who entered the circles and never returned, or who returned years later, having experienced only hours, or who emerged with knowledge they could not have acquired through ordinary means." He paused, withdrew from his coat pocket a small leather journal, worn and filled with what looked like decades of careful notes and observations. "I have documented 73 incidents," he said, "across various stone circle sites in Britain and Ireland, spanning the past 3 centuries. Incidents of disappearances, of temporal anomalies, of individuals who reported seeing other times or places while within the circles. Not all circles produce these effects, but certain ones, including this one, seem particularly active, particularly thin in their boundaries." Holmes reached out, and Granger, after a moment's hesitation, handed him the journal. Holmes opened it carefully, tilting it to catch starlight, reading entries at random, his expression growing increasingly thoughtful, increasingly engaged. "Have you witnessed anyone crossing through?" Holmes asked, his voice quiet but intense. "Have you seen the process occur?" Granger shook his head. "No, though I have come close, I believe. Twice I have been present when the lights appeared with particular intensity, when the sounds grew so loud and structured they seemed almost like speech. On both occasions, I felt a powerful pull, a sensation of being invited or called, an opportunity to step through if I chose. But I hesitated, and the moment passed, and I remained here, in this familiar world, with my questions unanswered and my courage proven insufficient. The honesty of this admission, the regret evident in his voice, created a moment of profound connection, of shared human limitation. We are all, I thought, standing at thresholds we lack the courage to cross, living with the consequences of our hesitations and our fears. The 17 sites on Thornwood's map, Holmes said, returning to the journal, continuing to scan its pages. Do they correspond to the locations you have identified as particularly active, particularly thin? Exactly, Granger confirmed, though I did not know of the map until after Thornwood's disappearance, when his niece mentioned it in her correspondence with the local constable. But yes, the 17 sites match perfectly with what I have independently identified as the most significant locations, the places where the boundary between worlds seems most permeable. A gust of wind moved through the circle, stronger than before, carrying with it a scent I could not identify. Something like ozone, like the air after lightning, charged and strange and sharp. The stars overhead seemed to pulse slightly, their light varying in intensity, creating the impression that the heavens themselves were breathing, contracting and expanding in some vast cosmic rhythm. If Thornwood crossed through, I asked, finding my voice for the first time in this strange conversation, is there any possibility he might return? Can the passage be reversed? Granger's expression grew sad, his eyes reflecting starlight and ancient uncertainties. I do not know, he admitted. The folklore is contradictory on this point. Some stories speak of returns, of people emerging years later, unchanged, as though time had flowed differently for them. Others suggest the crossing is permanent, that those who pass through never return to this world, though whether they die or simply exist in another mode of being, I cannot say. The fire we had not lit suddenly sparked into existence. Not a real fire, but a manifestation of light, similar to what we had witnessed earlier, concentrated now at the circle's exact center, burning with that same blue-white luminescence, growing in intensity until we had to shield our eyes against its brilliance. From within the light, or perhaps from somewhere beyond it, I thought I heard a voice, faint, distorted, but somehow familiar, as though crossing vast distances or passing through multiple layers of reality. It was saying something, repeating a phrase I could not quite distinguish, words that hovered just beyond comprehension. Holmes had moved closer to the light, his scientific instincts overcoming any natural caution, his hand extended as though to touch or measure this impossible phenomenon. Donald stood frozen, his face showing both terror and wonder, caught between the desire to flee and the compulsion to witness, to understand. Granger remained calm, his expression suggesting he had seen this before, or something like it, that for him this was familiar mystery rather than shocking revelation. The light pulsed 3 times, each pulse accompanied by that distant voice, that fragment of speech that seemed to be trying to reach us from wherever it originated. Then, as suddenly as it had appeared, the light vanished, leaving us in darkness again, with only the stars and the faint sound of the sea below. For a long moment, no one spoke. We simply stood, processing what we had witnessed, each attempting to find some frame of reference that could accommodate these experiences without complete surrender to irrationality or mysticism. That, Granger said finally, was more intense than anything I have previously witnessed here. Your presence seems to have activated something, amplified the phenomena, perhaps because you came seeking Thornwood specifically, because your intention resonated with whatever consciousness or force governs these manifestations. Holmes was breathing rapidly, his hands trembling slightly, a reaction I had never before witnessed in him, evidence of how deeply these events had affected his usually unshakable composure. "We must return," he said abruptly. "Return to London, to my laboratory, to places where rational analysis is possible. I need time to process these observations, to examine the physical evidence I have collected, to consult with experts in fields I have previously dismissed as irrelevant to detective work." But even as he spoke, I could hear the uncertainty in his voice, the recognition that perhaps his methods, his rational, analytical approach, might prove insufficient for this particular mystery, that some questions resist the application of logic and deduction, require instead intuition, imagination, perhaps even faith in possibilities, that science has not yet learned to measure or accept. We began the walk back to the village, all four of us now, Granger joining our small party, his presence somehow reassuring, the comfort of someone who had lived with these mysteries for decades, who had found ways to coexist with them without being destroyed by their implications. The journey seemed shorter returning, though that was surely impossible, a subjective impression created by exhaustion and mental overload. We spoke little, each absorbed in private thoughts, private attempts to make sense of what we had experienced. Dawn was breaking as we reached the village, the sky lightening from black to grey to a pale blue that promised fair weather, rare for this coast, a gift after the days of rain and wind. The fishing boats were already departing, their crews beginning the day's work, the eternal human activity of seeking sustenance from the sea, grounding existence in the practical necessities of survival and livelihood. Mrs. MacLeod had coffee and breakfast waiting, her knowing eyes asking no questions, simply providing what was needed, warmth and food, and the unspoken comfort of domestic routine maintained in the face of mystery and uncertainty. Granger shared our meal, speaking more freely now, describing his years of research, his attempts to interest the academic establishment in the phenomena he had documented, his eventual acceptance that some knowledge exists outside official recognition, that truth does not always require institutional validation to remain true. "Will you continue searching for Thornwood?" he asked Holmes as the meal concluded, as morning light filled the windows, making the night's experiences seem increasingly dreamlike, increasingly difficult to credit as actual rather than imagined. Holmes was silent for a long moment, his fingers steepled under his chin, his grey eyes distant, processing thoughts at depths I could not follow. "I will continue," he said finally, "but not as a conventional investigation. I will study the map more carefully, will attempt to decode the symbols using the understanding I have now gained. I will visit some of the other 16 sites, will document whether they exhibit similar phenomena, and I will correspond with Miss Thornwood, will help her understand that her uncle's disappearance, while tragic, may not have been entirely unwilled, may have been a choice he made to pursue knowledge into realms where conventional life could not follow. It was as close as I had ever heard Holmes come to acknowledging mystery beyond solution, accepting that some questions lead not to answers, but to deeper questions, that investigation sometimes reveals not clarity, but the vast extent of our ignorance, the profound limitations of our understanding. We spent one more day in the village, resting, recovering from the physical and mental exhaustion of our vigil at the stones. Granger visited again, bringing his journals and notes, sharing decades of careful observation with Holmes, who absorbed everything with the focused intensity he brought to all intellectual challenges. On the third day, we departed, taking the train south, beginning the long journey back to London, to the familiar world of gas lamps and hansom cabs, of criminal investigations and domestic routines. The landscape passed in reverse, the wild highlands gradually giving way to softer country, the stone walls becoming hedgerows, the ancient presence of the land yielding to the more managed, more humanized geography of southern Britain. Holmes was silent for much of the journey, occasionally making notes in his pocketbook, sometimes simply staring out the window, watching the country roll past, his mind working through problems and possibilities I could only guess at. "Do you believe it, Holmes?" I asked finally, as we neared London, as the city's smoke began to appear on the horizon. "Do you believe that Thornwood crossed through, that these stone circles are somehow doorways to other realms?" He did not answer immediately, seemed to weigh his words carefully, seemed to understand that his answer carried implications beyond the specific case, touched upon questions of worldview and fundamental assumptions about the nature of reality. "I believe," he said slowly, "that we have witnessed phenomena that resist conventional explanation. Whether those phenomena represent passage to other realms, or simply natural processes we do not yet understand, manifestations of energy fields, or electromagnetic effects that produce unusual perceptual experiences, I cannot say with certainty. What I can say is that Professor Thornwood believed he had discovered something significant, that he willingly went to that final site seeking confirmation, and that what occurred there removed him from ordinary reality in ways that conventional death or accident cannot adequately explain." He paused, turned from the window to meet my gaze directly. "I also believe," he continued, "that there is more mystery in the world than I have previously acknowledged, more strangeness than my rational methods can fully account for. This does not mean I abandon reason or empirical investigation, but it does mean I must expand my understanding of what constitutes evidence, what forms reality might take, what possibilities exist beyond the narrow boundaries of conventional scientific materialism." It was, I realized, a remarkable admission from a man who had built his entire method on the rigorous application of logic and observation, on the conviction that all mysteries could be solved through sufficient intelligence and attention to physical detail, that he could acknowledge the limitations of his approach, could open himself to possibilities he had previously dismissed, spoke to a flexibility of mind, a genuine commitment to truth that transcended ego or consistency. We reached London as evening fell, the familiar streets welcoming us back into their crowded embrace, the noise and smell and constant motion of the city a stark contrast to the wild isolation of the northern coast. Baker Street received us like old friends, Mrs. Hudson fussing over our return, preparing tea, rebuilding the fire, restoring the comfortable routines of our domestic life. The map, safely preserved in Miss Thornwood's keeping, awaited further study. The mystery of her uncle's disappearance remained, not solved, but perhaps reframed, understood in new terms that allowed for acceptance, if not closure. Holmes would continue his research, would visit other sites, would seek patterns and explanations, would pursue understanding with the same relentless focus he brought to all his investigations. But something had changed, I could tell. Some certainty had been shaken, some door opened that would not easily close. We had stood at the edge of mystery that exceeded our categories, had witnessed phenomena that demanded expansion of our worldview, had touched something ancient and strange that modern life had taught us to dismiss but could not entirely erase. And I sat across from him, as I had sat thousands of times, in this room that had hosted so many mysteries, so many adventures, so many moments of revelation and understanding. But tonight, the room felt different, larger somehow. Or perhaps it was the world that had grown larger, had revealed itself to contain depths and dimensions we had not suspected, possibilities we had not imagined. The clock ticked its patient measurement of time's passage. The gaslight created its familiar patterns on the ceiling. The city murmured its evening prayers. And we sat, two friends, contemplating mysteries both solved and unsolved, both near and impossibly distant, both simple and profound beyond measure. Dear listener, our journey into this mystery concludes here, not with absolute answers, but with wonder, with the recognition that the world contains secrets that exceed our grasp, that some questions lead not to tidy solutions, but to larger questions, deeper mysteries, greater appreciation for the vast unknown that surrounds our small islands of certainty. Professor Thornwood ventured into that unknown, seeking knowledge, pursuing understanding into territories where maps fail and conventional wisdom offers no guidance. Whether he found what he sought, whether he exists still in some form or realm beyond our perception, we cannot say with certainty. But perhaps that uncertainty is itself a kind of answer, a reminder that mystery serves purposes beyond resolution, that wonder has value independent of explanation. If you have found comfort in this tale, if these Victorian mysteries help quiet your thoughts and ease you toward peaceful sleep, I invite you to subscribe to this channel, to indicate your enjoyment with a like, to share these stories with others who might also find solace in the gentle exploration of mysteries, wrapped in the soothing language of another era. As you drift now toward sleep, let your mind release the day's concerns, the questions and worries that have occupied your waking hours. Let yourself float on that tide that carries us from consciousness into dreams, from the known into the mysterious territories of sleep, where all things become possible, where the boundaries dissolve, and we exist in states our waking minds cannot quite comprehend. The stones stand still on their northern headland, patient as stars, keeping their ancient vigil. The wind moves through them, creating music for those who listen. The lights appear and fade, according to rhythms we have not learned to predict or control. And somewhere, in some realm or mode of being we cannot quite imagine, perhaps Professor Thornwood continues his observations, pursues his research, measures the stars by instruments and understanding we have yet to discover. Sleep well, dear friend. May your dreams be gentle and your rest complete. May you wake refreshed, ready to face whatever mysteries your own life presents, armed with curiosity and wonder, open to possibilities beyond the narrow boundaries of the everyday. Good night, and may peace find you in the quiet hours, May comfort surround you like familiar blankets. May the ancient mysteries we have explored together fade into the gentle background of your dreaming mind, leaving only warmth and rest and the deep assurance that the world, mysterious as it is, holds beauty and meaning for those patient enough to seek, brave enough to question, wise enough to accept that some answers arrive only when we stop demanding them, when we simply rest, simply breathe, simply allow ourselves to be. Good night.